Hey everyone, this is Allie with the Right Place, Right Time, award-winning author and international book coach and ghostwriter, hitting you up today with another Memoir Minute where you can learn writing memoir 1 minute at a time. So if you've been following along in these last few, we've been talking about different craft devices that most fiction writers use that memoirists also need to employ in order to write an emotionally compelling memoir. Today we're talking about dialogue. Dialogue being that conversation between one or more people. Now, writing dialogue can be a sticky wicket when you're not sure how you're supposed to format who said what. We've read a lot of dialogue in the books that we pick up, but when we go to write it, it can be a more challenging thing. So here are a few quick things to be thinking about when you're writing dialogue. Number one, consider the fact that most dialogue doesn't mean that there are only two people using words to communicate. Meaning that when you go to write dialogue into a scene on the page, it can't just be one line of dialogue preceded by another line of dialogue. We need to include action in between what's being said. So, did that person scratch their chin in the middle of the conversation, run their fingers through their hair, look off to the distance? Perhaps they were thinking something in the midst of the conversation. Maybe they were pulled back to a memory really quickly. Perhaps they had to clear their throat or they started crying. Maybe there was a pause in the conversation because the other person didn't know how to respond right away. All of these things need to be captured in between the individual lines of dialogue. The other thing to consider is that when we're speaking back and forth with one another, it's not always I say one sentence, the other person says another sentence. Sometimes I might say multiple sentences in a row before the other person has a chance to actually weigh in. So dialogue also needs to look and sound like an actual conversation taking place. So thinking about what are the other things happening during the dialogue, what's the flow or cadence of the dialogue in terms of who's speaking, how long they're speaking before another person jumps in. And then, of course, this gets a little bit more dicey and complicated when you're adding in a third or fourth or fifth voice, because maybe there's a scene where there's multiple people. So you have to be thinking about everybody's kind of actions. What's everybody doing in the midst of the dialogue? You have to consider what the main character is thinking during the process of this conversation. And you have to think about the cadence of who's talking when, for how long. The other thing to be thinking about is making sure that the reader understands who the person is that's speaking. Now, a lot of the times we will see this as they said, she said, he said at the end of a line, or I asked, or they responded. Now, those are all good indicators of who in the scene or in the conversation is actually saying the thing that's being said. But you also don't want it to read as, let's say, the sky is blue, I said. Look at the clouds, they're so white, they said. I can't believe there are no birds in the sky, I said. Okay, you can see that at the end of each of these lines of dialogue, I'm using some pronoun and then said at the end. The pronoun isn't the issue necessarily. The pronoun needs to be specific to who is your speaker, but it's the fact that said is being used every single time, which gets to be a little bit monotonous and a little bit hard for a reader to look at and hear as they're reading kind of internally throughout a scene. So you want to break that up, use different verbs other than said, or on occasion, if there's only two people in a scene, you might not have to actually indicate every single line which person is talking, because the action or the internal thought that you're putting around that line of dialogue will indicate who the speaker is. Now, the other thing about dialogue is formatting. It's easier to read when most lines of dialogue, and I say most because there are exceptions, but we don't have time to cover that today. Each line of dialogue should go on its own individual line and indented, and start with a double quotation mark before the actual line of dialogue, and should close with a double quotation mark before you indicate who it was that spoke. If you read a lot, novels or memoirs, you just need to pay attention to what's happening in a scene where dialogue is being used, and study how the dialogue is being formatted so that you know how to type it on the page. So these are just a handful of things to think about in formulating dialogue for your memoir. Certainly not getting more than just surface level. There's a lot more that we could dive into and we could talk about writing dialogue for your book, but this is just a 5-minute quick study to get you going. If you would like to spend more time talking about your book, then please, please, please jump on a story stroll with me. The link is in the description of this video. I'd love to spend some time talking to you about your book and what's standing in your way of getting it done. And beyond that, I also want you to head on over to therightplacerightTime.com and grab your 5-step writing guide to starting and finishing a memoir. This is going to give you that 30,000-foot view of the steps along the path from blank page to publication. And we'll let you know a little bit about each of those steps along the way, which is really important to developing a really great book. Okay, that's it for now. I will see you again next time.